Hello everyone, welcome back to another first impressions video on the JayBee Milly channel. I am JayBee, and as you may have guessed, I have just finished watching episode 3 of HBO Max's Velma show, and I have a lot of thoughts to say about it. But just a bit of housekeeping before we get into that. This visual that you see on the screen is the only visual that's going to be present, so this is going to be completely spoiler free, and it's just going to be how I think about the episode directly after watching it, as opposed to a constructive review, which is coming soon, or Milly's reaction video to the episode itself, which is also coming soon. Also stick around for some Easter egg videos, as there may be one or two that we can pick apart here, but regardless, let's just get straight into it. Now, as I did say in the first impressions video of episode 2, this similarly starts with a previously on highlight reel, which kind of gives a bit of a clue that possibly this series was meant to be one episode every week. However, either through HBO Max restructuring at the last minute, or possibly even the network losing faith in this show, now we're up to 2 episodes every week, and so the previously on section does seem kind of redundant. Not only that, but if this is a show geared towards adults, I don't want to make any assumptions, but I would assume that an adult wouldn't need a recap of a kind of short 20-minute segment, but it's a welcome thing. You can ignore it if you don't need it, and you can enjoy it if you do need it. I will say, it's stylized within to the episode itself once again, so you do get that initial integration, so I don't mind it at all. And straight off the bat, I'm actually quite positive about the first 5 minutes or so about this episode. Of course, it does a bit of juvenile humour, which I'm not a big fan of for this series, because so far I will say, for an adult Scooby show that's centred to a more adult, mature audience, I'm finding the animated Mystery Incorporated show way more mature by comparison. This kind of seems a bit juvenile. But I do like how for once, it's actually taking a trope about the characters we know. So Velma, after the end of the last episode, is dealing with some emotions that I think the fans and the fan theories have speculated on for quite a long time now. And so it's nice for them to actually make something, from that lore of Velma and kind of play with it a little bit here for the first couple of minutes. It reminds me a little bit of how the 2002 movie would do things like calling, Shaggy's love interest Mary Jane. Obviously, this isn't masterclass writing, but it's at least a welcome change to see that whereas episode 1 and 2 could be completely different characters, completely devoid from the realm of Scooby, which works in its favour in some ways, but also kind of defeats the point of the series in another way. I like that here, it seems like the writer has actually watched and is familiar with the franchise and is playing around with it a little bit. And there's also a nice bit with Norville's dad as well, which I kind of like. It's just a bit of a cheeky scene, but I think the weakness is consistently Velma and Mindy Kaling, as there's once again another one of those one-liners which is quite heavily reliant on pop culture reference. And I'm not one of those people that are completely against pop culture references in media. I just kind of feel like you run the risk of alienating the people that don't understand it in the present day. But also, you're going to need to be referencing something that's going to be here for the long haul. Like, I don't know what Velma says, this is from the trailer, so it isn't a spoiler, but she says you can't speculate on someone's sexuality nowadays unless they're famous or da-da-da-da. Like, I forgot the name of that at the moment, but I had no idea who this second person that she mentioned is, so I was completely lost on that. I was like, yeah, I guess there's some exceptions to that rule, so kind of a bit of a smile from the side of my mouth moment, but it's like, okay, so clearly this show is telling me that the type of person to watch this is the type of person to get that joke, so maybe I'm completely out of the loop with modern day pop culture, but that kind of took me out like, okay, I guess. So that was another one of those moments that I wasn't a huge fan of, but it is just a one-liner, so it's easily forgotten. Now, as the screenshots that we've already covered have mentioned, this episode is largely taking part in what I speculated at as some type of tournament or competition. I thought maybe pep rally, but then I did analyse that screenshot of the billboard having a little bit of a combat class. Now, without going too much into that, I will say that there is a lot of not clever or snappy wit constructing stuff like mental health or even the process of going to therapy and having a therapist. And I think wisely so in a way. I think it was, if it was to take a stance either being pro therapy or anti therapy, it would genuinely be a bit of a harmful message, because for all therapy, I personally tried it and it really wasn't for me. I do think that maybe it was because the therapist I actually had at the time didn't have my best interest at heart. There's a lot of context around that. But just going into it, my opinion of therapy was quite negative. However, there's so many people that I look up to that are in therapy and it's changed their lives. So I'm kind of neutral on the topic. And so I think it would be unwise for this show, which so far has been quite juvenile, to dive into it in a serious way. But it all pans out the thing, like, I like the premise of, let's play about with therapy a bit. Let's play about with the construct of a tournament and prep rally. But it just seemed to me very much like an episode of The Office, in that it seemed very episodic. Like, there wasn't a massive structure to it, but it was like, like how some episodes would be called, The Day Out or The Office Party, or, this, like, it was a gimmicky episode is kind of what I'm getting to. And so I like it for the premise of a sitcom episode. I'm not really sure how it furthered the Velma story, apart from the fact that it wasn't awful. That's what I'll say about it. So, a bit of a weird take to go at narratively, but I don't think they do it completely awfully. Now, another section that this kind of delves deeper into is Velma and the panic attacks that she's happening. I've seen a lot of discourse on Twitter with people saying this is the wrong thing for Daphne to do during a panic attack. This isn't like a great representation. And I'm gonna disagree and agree at the same time with that. I don't think that just because a person has experienced a panic attack or anything like that, it makes them an expert on panic attacks themselves. Now, 100%, Daphne kind of shocking Velma in the last episode was wrong. I do think that is a good take to have, because if you're not with someone and you're not intimately connected with them to the point where you know what's going to panic them even more, you know what's going to set them off, then just assess the situation a bit more. She definitely did the wrong thing in my opinion. But I think panic attacks are that type of thing where lots of people have different reactions to them, and they're not always the same one. Like, I was riddled with panic attacks when I started university 4 years ago. They've been clear of me for 2 years now, thankfully. But when I was riddled with them, sometimes I did need, for example, Millie to come in and cuddle me and to just kind of remind me of what my whereabouts were. And so to that end, that shock kind of initial physical contact would have been welcome. Other times I just wanted to lock myself in a room by myself, absolutely no noise, and just feel something really cold. So I think there isn't a one size fits all when it comes to dealing with panic attacks. So it could be that Velma does need that type of thing to get rid of her panic attacks. But overall, I do stand by that the notion of the panic attacks being depicted like that is a little bit too goofy, and it's almost like how you'd explain a panic attack to a child. Yes, so when you get into these states, it's like a monster that's roaming at you. It's a bit too allegorical. And it's kind of interesting because I saw on Twitter people were commenting, comparing the panic attack scene from Velma to the new Puss in Boots movie, where that character also had a panic attack. And it was way more mature there. It was more hard-hitting and true to, I guess, emotion. I don't want to say that it's impossible for people to feel like they're being attacked by a monster during a panic attack, but it definitely seemed less sensationalized, which, for a serious topic that people watching could relate to, I think is a much better way to go. But, I mean, if it's an excuse to give us some monsters in the Velma show, I suppose from that angle it kind of makes sense. And bear in mind, we don't even know what the story is. It could very well be that it's Velma's dad who is the villain, and he's perhaps putting some type of chemical or something in her food every day that's making her hallucinate every time she wants to solve a mystery. Thus, he knows that she won't figure him out. That could be revealed, and then every criticism about that bit is kind of null and void, so we'll hold judgment until that. But that's kind of my take on that whole mental health route that this episode takes. Now, a thing that I was worried about going into this episode was that dynamic between Daphne and Velma. I think I was scared that the progress that was made at the end of episode 2 was going to be turned into some vulgar joke or some over sensationalized thing for impressions and to go trending. And I think for the most part, this episode actually did it quite well. Like, I wasn't expecting it to go from point A to the last stage in that whole one episode turnaround, but they definitely developed it in a way where, sure, you might think it's a bit toxic, around the middle especially, but I think the overall conclusion was very good. And I think playing upon that, if that's the hook for the rest of the series, if they make that compelling, I actually kind of like it. I was also a big fan of that whole tournament setup. Like, again, I'm not going to get into any spoilers, but it kind of reminded me a bit of like the startup of a crossover boxing bout. It was actually really entertaining, and it was absolutely amazing to see Daphne be more of the Daphne that I love from the 2002 movie, who could take on, you know, that big wrestler's Arcos and do all that type of stuff that I love her from that movie. I think it does just evolve into a bit of shock factor at the end. Like, again, I'm not a huge fan of swearing and blood equals adult and mature. As I say, and I stand by it even after this episode, and it sounds like I'm being positive, but I do stand by that Mystery Incorporated does a mature Scooby a billion times better. That's not what I'm expecting from this series anymore, and it is unfortunate. But Mystery Incorporated and the 2002 movie for me are always going to be what I turn to when I think of adult Scooby-Doo. This is just kind of like a bizarre subsection, and to that end, I kind of do try and forgive it for going that route of blood and swearing equals adult. But I think when it's a beloved character doing that, it kind of ruins it for me and takes me out of the moment. Because if our lovable characters, or not lovable, let's say they're unlikable, they're meant to be unlikable, that's fine. But if our characters that we're following can cause such harm to someone where it's a joke, then what's the difference between them and the killer? Is the killer doing it seriously and that's why they're the bad person versus, say, Daphne or Velma who causes harm to someone but it's used for a one-liner? And to that end, we're then in a position where the killer is arguably more respectful of human life, taking it either for their version of a purpose or they're treating it with the weight it deserves. Like, death is bad, harm is bad, and that's what the villain is inflicting upon to do bad things. Whereas in Daphne and Velma's world, Daphne and Velma hurting someone is funny, is comedy, is shock factor. It doesn't really add up. Like, how are we meant to get on their side when they're doing the same stuff that the bad guy is? Except they're laughing about it, the bad guy isn't. Do you kind of get what I'm saying? So I absolutely hated that about this episode, and I don't see it stopping anytime soon, which is a shame. But again, I will maintain that we don't know anything about the bad guy yet. It could be that they're not actually, like, you know what I mean? It could be any type of plot twist imaginable. We're very early stages, but I was not a fan about how they treated the blood and gore in this episode. So that's about it. Like, I think I've covered pretty much everything in order that it all happened in. There was this type of peppering in of Fred in this episode, and that remains to be the weakest for me in this, which is a shame because I kind of feel like he was maybe the only funny part of the other sections in episode 1 and 2. Whereas here, he was just taking away from the storyline that I actually wanted to see. So I wasn't a big fan of that. But at least, say, Norville's involvement with that section of the storyline does seem to be set to further the plot going forward. So if I do need to put up with that kind of sub-story just to get to what I want, then maybe it'll pay off, maybe not, time will tell. Another thing that I really hated is, I know she's popular, but Wanda Sykes to me is just so annoying. I just think she's the type of humour that I really don't connect with. You know, that kind of loud and obnoxious is funny. I don't get that. Maybe I've been spoiled being raised on British TV, which, if anything, is, you know, cold, grey and dreary. Done right equals funny. So maybe that's just my sensibilities creeping in. But yeah, not a fan of Wanda Sykes, and I don't know why they're trying to promote that cop duo that are Daphne's mums, who I think are actually along with Velma herself, the weakest parts of the show. Like, they did some cringy thing in episode 2. They were back here, it's peppering unfunny comedy into things, and I don't even want to call it comedy. It was just screaming for the sake of trying to get a laugh out of someone, which, yeah, for an adult show, I don't know who that's for. It seems like something that it would entertain a 2-year-old, and I don't really want 2-year-olds to watch this, but that's my take on it. So far, this is my favourite episode so far, but whether that's going to be high praise or low praise going forward, time will tell. So that was my first impressions. Again, like I say, there's going to be a lot more content surrounding this, including an Easter egg breakdown video, a reaction video, and when the whole series is out, we will do proper reviews on each episode, which may be released daily, weekly, we're not really sure yet. But if you're more of a fan of traditional Scooby-Doo, we do weekly Scooby-Doo interviews. The one that's going out on Saturday and being announced Friday is, I think, going to be a lot of people's favourites going forward, and that's all I'm going to say about it right now, but I'm super excited to announce it. So yeah, for more content, please like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.